Uh, Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests watching us live in Facebook and YouTube. This is Rudranarayan Das, Executive Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. Welcomes you all to this global digital platform of intellectual gathering. This program is called the World Human Sciences and Management Conference 2021, organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and Amiso University, Odisha, Cuttack. The broader theme of this conference is ethnological context, disciplinary practices of social sciences and policy frames. On behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, I extend my profound gratitude to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Professor Sarath Kumar Palita, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Odisha, and Professor Dr. Sanjay Kumar Naik, Vice Chancellor, Amiso University, Cuttack. The convener of this largest virtual conference, eminent Indian historian, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, and eminent policy activist, writer, and philanthropist, Mr. Charudat Panigrahi. I would like to share a few words about CARD. The Center for Adivasi Research and Development is a leading research-oriented institution promoting ethnographic, empirical, and evidence-based research for engaging and addressing the challenges that 21st century's globe is facing today. Prime agenda of this institution is to come up with potential policy solutions for social change while believing in the idea of 3D, that is debate, dialogue, and discussion. And with expertise, experience, and experiencing and education, E3, the institution focus on marginalized communities and works for their livelihood to protect their nature, culture, and language and identity in particular. The age of modernity has witnessed that change is the only constant phenomenon for societal purpose to enhance knowledge. Our information work for them is methodical and avoids paradoxically frameworks which neglected so many centuries from theory to become practice. The CARD sincerely believes in the concept of social marketing, which seriously looking for non-profit glorify generations to come. Center for Adivasi Research and Development come to serve with the holistic approach of critical thinking in education to fill the gaps to plan accordingly for voiceless communities, for beneficiaries, direct in self-reflecting global societies. Ladies and gentlemen, in this evening, we have with us a very eminent personality of her field, is none other than Professor Amiso George. She is the chair professor of strategic communication at Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, Texas. So will deliver a talk on crisis communication from a cultural perspective. Now, without wasting much time, I would like to invite Dr. Nina Das to introduce Professor Amiso George to our audiences. Over to you, Dr. Nina Das. Dr. Nina Das, please unmute and start.
Hello, sir. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Okay. Good evening, all of you, and namaskar, ma'am. and on esteemed director sir and all the dignitaries, professors present here, esteemed our esteemed key chief speaker of today's evening. Ma'am, I would like to welcome on behalf of CARD and on behalf of जो हमारा Center of Tribal Research and Development, Ravenshaw University, IIM Sambalpur, and Central University Koraput. I'd like to introduce about ma'am. Ma'am needs no introduction still. Amiso in George, ma'am. She is professor and former chair of the Strategic Communication Department in Bob Schiffer College of Communication at Texas Christian University, Fort Worth, Texas. A 2020 Fulbright Scholar. She is the Public Relations Society of America 2017 Educator of the Year. She also received the 2017 Breeze Award for Excellence in Strategic Communication Research from the International Crisis and Risk Communication Conference and the University of Central Florida Nicholson School of Communication. Ma'am was director of the Public Relations Program at the Reno School of Journalism, University of Nevada, Reno, where she's developed and taught the first course in crisis communication. A visiting professor of strategic communication at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia. In 2012, she had worked as a journalist and freelance broadcaster in radio and television and for non-profit organizations in the United States, including C-SPAN and universities in Nigeria, Australia, and Malaysia. She has also been widely quoted in local and national media on crisis communication cases. She was vice president of the Greater Fort Worth chapter of Public Relations Society of America and a Carnegie Foundation Fellow. George Ma'am is co-editor of Culture and Crisis Communication, Transboundary Cases from Northwestern Societies, Crisis Communication and International Perspective on Hits and Misses, and Race, Gender, and Other Minorities. Readings for professional communicators. She consults in risk and crisis communication. We are really blessed to have you, ma'am, on this platform. I welcome you to India and to all the research scholars, professors, and I would like to invite you to deliver talk. We are really blessed to have with us. Thank you, sir. Over to you, Rudra, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello.
Should I get started? Yeah.
Yeah, madam. I would like to Professor Amiso George to initiate your talk.
Okay. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for welcoming me. This is such an honor for me to get to speak with all of you, really incredibly brilliant Indian population from in different universities, and wherever you are listening or watching this program. So it really is an honor for me. It is Sunday morning in Texas on a very, very hot day. And I'm really delighted to be here with you. And yeah, so let's get started. I am going to share my screen with you as I begin speaking. And I will make this PowerPoint available to all of you. And I understand we have about 70 minutes or so. So I will speak probably for about 40-45 minutes and then open up for questions, because I'm sure that there would be quite a number of questions from the viewers and the listeners. So we are going to get started. So I'm going to be sharing my screen right now. Okay, here we are. So what an opportune time to talk about crisis communication. The whole world is in a pandemic. And what else is anyone talking about everywhere, regardless of where you are in the world? We are all looking at the way governments around the world are dealing with this pandemic that no one really anticipated. But here we are, and crisis communication has come front and center. People are talking about it. People are finding ways, how do we maximize, how do we get information out to people? There's a plethora of confusing information, sometimes contradictory information about this pandemic, this COVID-19. So it creates really a challenge for people who are either not very well informed or have too much information, contradictory information. What do they do? But as we all know, in times of crisis, people need to have information with which to make decisions. And of course, crisis is an opportunity. And I want to just start out by just mentioning, of course, I've been following news in India prior to my presentation. So I want to, of course, extend my concern and my condolence to the folks in the state of Kerala who have really been suffering through the incredible flooding and monsoon that has devastated properties and lives. So my condolence to all of the folks in that area and all of those who have gone through all kinds of natural disasters in your part of the world. So let's take a look at crisis communication, but not just taking a look at it, but looking at it from a cultural perspective, because that is something that had always been missing up until recently, that crisis communication was done strictly from a Western perspective, without taking into consideration that while the concepts are perfect, are wonderful, but when one takes the same concept into a different part of the world, a different culture, some adjustments would have to be made. But let's take a look at crisis. What does that mean? You know, what is it and how is it defined? Okay, I love this cartoon here. This how it is captioned, that in crisis, don't panic, everything is under control. Now, who is this person, or who are the persons who come up to people and say to them, don't panic, everything is under control? Well, you have a group of people, you have people behind the scenes, people who are part of a crisis team in any organization, in any government, regardless. There are always this group of people who are charged with taking care of things, to ensure that things run smoothly, to guide people as to where they should go and what they should do. They're the ones who, while everyone is running around like chickens with their heads cut off, there's always this group of people who come in and say, don't panic, everything is under control. So I just love using this to make my point. How is crisis defined? On the surface, we look at crisis as a danger, of course, because it is disruptive. It is disruptive to our normal way of life, to our daily lives. But crisis is also an opportunity to learn from the mistakes, to make things better in future, hopefully. So crisis is looked on as danger by some, but is also looked on as opportunity by others. So how do we define crisis? Of course, there are many definitions of crisis. All you have to do is Google, grab your favorite crisis textbook. You're going to find an array, a plethora of definitions. But among the common themes that run across all of those definitions is that crisis is a major occurrence. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a crisis. It is a major occurrence, usually unanticipated, but it may also be predictable. It may be predictable because oftentimes we are given the signs that if certain things are not taken care of, it could be a problem. For instance, if there is a road project and there have been cracks on the road and there have been reports about the cracks on the road and nothing was done about it, and then something happens one day, it goes completely bad when probably there are motorists on the road and there may be fatalities. And then people will be very surprised. But the reality is that we've been given signs all along the cracks, and then the local people who live in that area have been complaining about this, but nothing was done about it. So in that sense, it may be predictable. Obviously, crisis has negative consequences or potentially negative consequences, and it affects the operation of an organization or industry, the publics, the products, the services, and the image of that organization. Okay. Now, international crisis, and I started out by mentioning COVID because it is a global pandemic. It is a global pandemic because it's not restricted to one country. The world is much more interconnected these days, more than ever. Crisis is much more transboundary than ever because we get on a plane, we fly somewhere, we take with us whatever it is we have, we are connecting with people in different parts of the world. So it is very easy for things to be transmitted because we are connected. So crisis in that sense is much more transboundary. It is not limited to one particular geographic region of the world. And as a result, we see a lot more situations where something may have started in one part of the world, it is carried to different parts of the world. There is also more evidence of the intersection of culture and crisis communication. Because when we get on the plane or we connect with people from all parts of the world, and we are from different parts of the world, it is inevitable that our response to issues, whether they be crisis or otherwise, might be slightly different, as we have also seen with COVID. The response to COVID and also the hesitancy in getting vaccines. And that is for those who are lucky enough to have the vaccines available. And that's something very important because there are places, people, well, obviously in this country, who have access to vaccine, but are refusing to take it. So that's quite different from places where people do not have enough or have enough access to vaccine. So culture, I believe very strongly, is at the center of how we communicate and should be at the center of how we communicate to different audiences at all times, but more so in a crisis. And culture results in the significant differences in the way we see things, the way we know things, and the way we do things. So why is this important? Again, I started out by mentioning pandemic across borders. If something happens, here are a couple of examples that I want to share with you. And of course, I'll make this available so you can always go and click on those links to see why crisis is truly transboundary and why international crisis communication is important. So COVID is a very good example. And some of you may or may not have heard of the Boeing Max plane crashes. One happened in Indonesia and another one happened in Ethiopia. While the planes were manufactured in the US, one was being used by Ethiopian airline and another by an airline in Asia, but the passengers were from all over. But again, look at the international connection. The airline in Asia, Indonesia, well, Asia obviously, manufactured in the US. Same thing with Ethiopia. The plane, the Boeing, was manufactured in the US, but used in Ethiopia by Ethiopian Airlines, and the passengers were from all over. So when those fatal plane crashes occurred, they were not limited to Ethiopia and Indonesia. They were transboundary, not just because of where the planes were manufactured, but also because of the passengers on the plane. So you see how a crisis is no longer limited to a particular place. Even if there is a conflict in a particular part of the world, like what's going on in Ethiopia right now in the Tigray region, there are consequences, there are implications for not just those places, not just Ethiopia, but the countries around Ethiopia and the global population. So crisis is not limited. Well, what about the Malaysian airline flight, MH370, that disappeared? And then the one that was shut down over the air in Ukraine. Again, you see the direction that I'm going with this and why international crisis communication is absolutely important. So as you're listening to me talk now, we're talking about crisis. They all seem to be, violent and, things like that. Yes, those are crises. Crisis can be violent. Crisis can also be non-violent. Crisis can be an act of nature, like the monsoon, the hurricanes, the earthquakes. Crisis can be intentional. Someone intentionally tampering with the supply chain of a product or the manufacturing process, thereby creating, getting something in there that harms people. Crisis could also be accidental, an explosion on an oil rig or a fire, that sort of thing. Those are also crises. So it's not just our concept, the general concept about crisis being just something violent. Of course, crisis could also, and is these days, cyber crisis. That is a huge thing. Think about disruptions to financial services. If a banking system is disrupted by rogue people, it affects our ability to conduct banking services online or whatever the case might be. That is a crisis for the bank because it has to figure out, well, what do we do? What are our alternatives? What are our plan B? So there are different types of crisis. Rumor is also a type of crisis because a rumor can damage the reputation, if not dealt with right away, can damage the reputation of an organization. It is important to recognize that in a crisis, there's some elements that just pop to the top. Generally speaking, one of the elements of crisis is the suddenness of it, the surprise of it. Now, keep in mind what I said earlier, that generally crisis is a surprise. No one is expecting it, but sometimes we are given hints. We are given hints that something may happen if something is not taken care of. But generally, when the crisis does occur, it takes us by surprise. And another element is that there is insufficient information, because if the crisis is breaking, things are dynamic. The situation is dynamic. So for instance, if there was an explosion and there were fatalities, maybe the initial number that we got once it happened may be revised because simply that information was not accurate. So there's generally insufficient information. The situation is dynamic and it escalates rapidly. Things are moving very, very fast. And in such situation, if care is not taken, there is always some loss of control. People, if they're not well organized, if they don't have a plan, they don't have a team, okay, there is that sense of loss of control. Things are happening very quickly. And of course, these days, everyone or most people have smartphones, all right? So people are going to pull out their smartphones. They're going to be recording even before the media get there. So there is also that sense of a loss of control. And then scrutiny not just from the media, but from the average person who is nearby, who pulls out his or her cell phone and takes images and uploads it onto their social media or sends it to a friend via WhatsApp, and it just goes from there. And then of course the media descends on the crisis situation in that place. It just escalates everything. So there is that scrutiny. And then for people who have not or are not used to dealing with crisis in their workplace, they have in some situations, they have a siege mentality. They don't want to talk to anyone. They want to try to control it and not talk to anyone. And what happens is this, of course, the rumors are going to be flying. Folks are taking pictures and uploading it. The media are there asking questions. And for some, it can be a bit overwhelming. But the reality is that when a crisis occurs, it needs immediate response. It needs immediate response. And I'm going to take you through the 3 stages of a crisis, regardless of where it occurs. And I'm going to now show you, or rather share with you, where and how culture fits in, because culture fits in at all the stages of crisis. An understanding of the culture of the audience that you're dealing with makes all the difference, in how the response to the crisis, and how the audience that you're trying to communicate to, how they're going to receive it. And several studies have shown that as well. So these are the stages of a crisis. What should one do before a crisis occurs, and not wait until the crisis occurs? What should one do when the crisis occurs? And what should one do post-crisis? So we'll take a look at these 3 stages. So in preparing for crisis, obviously every organization should always anticipate that a crisis is going to occur and plan accordingly. Now, the difference when you're looking at things from a cultural perspective, let's say in a village situation, it is not enough for one to sit in their offices and brainstorm with management. That is very important. They must do that. But they should also brainstorm with community leaders. And that's why I have that in red. Brainstorm with the people who are in that area, who live close to the ground and who know what is going on in their community. Basically, how can we work with you to help you? It is important as part of the pre-crisis to assess issues and risks within the organization and within that community with the external public. What are the issues that are there? Now, I should say that while it is important to do all of this, in most cases, the resources may not always be there. We must recognize that. Financial and human resources may not be there. So while we recognize the risks and issues within a community, for instance, they may not have a way of solving it. And this is where prioritizing comes in. What is most important? How do we prioritize and deal with the most important ones? And then maybe deal with the others if we can afford it, okay? It is important also as part of preparation to monitor crisis elsewhere. If, say, for instance, there is a situation of forest fires, and it happens every year, what are people doing elsewhere, somewhere else that is happening? And if we have a similar terrain, what can we learn from those other people to help us better prepare to avoid what they have gone through? Think of that one of the first slides that I showed you, that a crisis is seen as an opportunity, okay? And part of preparation, of course, is determining the potential effect of a crisis when it occurs, the potential effect on your publics, your audience, okay? At the core of all of this is communication. Communication. In preparing for a crisis, which we hope doesn't occur, but which we know could possibly occur, is to take a look at all those things that I mentioned in the previous slide. In essence, sort of your risk assessments. What are the risks? How do you prioritize those risks? And then let the folks, and then when you work with a community, work with the community leaders, and you help them to recognize their role in the crisis planning. They take ownership. because people like to protect that which is theirs, as opposed to people coming in from headquarters and telling them, this is what you should do, this is how you should do it. But when you incorporate, when you make them part of your pre-crisis planning, they're going to take ownership. Communicate that to them, get them involved. It's not that you get them to do your work, but get their input, get their buy-in, and then communicate your findings to ensure that when the time comes, they would take the right action for their community. And when you come in to help them, you're going to work in tandem. You're going to work cooperatively to ensure that things work well within the community. And that is something that is unique here when you consider culture, when you put culture at the core of what you do. Keeping people posted about what potentially could go wrong within their community, but getting them involved, getting them to be part of your plan makes a huge difference. So communication is key. Communication is key at all levels. Communicate to your stakeholders before, during, and after a crisis to minimize damage to your reputation. Because with the example that I gave earlier, the villagers, for instance, are going to say, yeah, we had several meetings about this, and we have been told what to do, and we will be in the front line to help protect our community. So when the crisis actually occurs and the government officials show up there, they're going to be working with the villagers. There'll be a lot more cooperation. And you communicate to minimize stress and confusion. When people know that this is their role, that they have also been incorporated as part of the crisis plan, you would get, I mean, again, not guaranteed 100%, but generally speaking, and also studies have shown that the more people feel that they are part of the process, the more likely they are willing to cooperate. So communicate to them. And communicating during a crisis helps to minimize stress. People know what to do. They already know what to do. And it minimizes confusion. They know what to do and they know what actions to take, basically. So you also communicate within your own organization to help your organization manage your human and material resources. Not every organization has carte blanche, has, money and all the resources and everything. Not everyone has that. So again, you prioritize what is most important and how can you deploy the human resources that you have to deal with the issues that are most important to your organization. Part of the pre-planning is also having a crisis plan, okay? A crisis plan that is documented goes a long way. It makes a huge difference because in a crisis, you have to be able to respond very, very quickly with accurate information. So it is important to have that plan in place before a crisis occurs. It is important to have messages, what we called holding messages, in place before the crisis occurs. It is important that you know how to reach your audiences because in different cultures, it may be different. But the important thing to remember, the way that you've always used to reach a particular audience, the channels that you've always used to reach a particular audience, those are the channels you will still use. During a crisis is not the time for you to think of a new channel. For instance, let me go back to the example that I used in Kerala, right? If people are used to getting the information from a particular, maybe radio, maybe television, in the local language, that's what you're going to use because that's the first place they're going to go to look for information. Whatever channels they use, that's where you're going to go. You're not going to start then at the time of the crisis thinking of new interesting ways to reach them. That's just not going to work. And I'm sure that you all recognize this. So use the channels that they are already familiar with to reach them. Okay. It is important also that a crisis plan make allowances for mistakes. Errors are going to be made. You know, information may be wrong because, not deliberately, because that is the information that you had at that time. And if that is the case, let people know. And I understand that in some cultures, the level of apologies differs, okay? But you're thinking of a life and death situation. People need accurate information, because rumors can just take off and create havoc when people are not given the right information. So it is important to communicate that to them. And if a mistake is made, to correct it right away, because people are making decisions based on the information they have. Let's say, again, back to the flooding situation. Let's say the initial information was that, oh, don't move from your location. But in reality, that was a mistake. And immediately got the correct information, move from your location. It is important to correct it right away and say, get the information out. You need to move from your location because it is dangerous. Okay. A good crisis plan, again, must always acknowledge the audience's pain. Okay, because perception is reality. Let's say, for instance, the chief minister, you know, again, back to, because I just read, you've been following Indian news just before my presentation. So I wanted to make sure that I use at least pretty current examples. Let's say the chief minister goes to visit the site of the floods and met with some of the survivors. The first thing to do is to acknowledge their pain. Why? Because human beings are more important than anything, than houses, than roads. And I'm not saying those are not important. They're of course very important, but human lives are more important. Simply acknowledging their pain goes a long way to making them feel that someone cares about them as ordinary human beings, as people. And then, of course, talk about other issues. And here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're doing, and so on and so forth. That acknowledgement of pain, audience's pain, it goes a long way, because perception is reality. You know, ordinary people tend to just see people in high positions as a bit disconnected from them. And in many cultures, when someone in a high position comes along and acknowledges a simple rhetoric, acknowledges the pain of somebody who has gone through a catastrophic situation, a catastrophic crisis such as that, while it doesn't automatically solve the person's problem, but it goes a long way psychologically in making that person feel better. So yes, acknowledging the pain is very important. And then, of course, reiterate the relationship, the organization, or whether the government's relationship with the stakeholders meaning the public of that place. Again, you have to understand your culture and know what is appropriate. But the acknowledgement of aggrieved audience's pain is universal, regardless of the culture. People like to feel valued. People like to feel that others in positions of power value their lives. A good crisis plan before the crisis has to have those things. It has to have clearly defined objectives. Who is it trying to reach? What are the messages? And what are the channels of communication? This is just your very basic communication model. What do you want to achieve? Who are you trying to reach? What is the message? And how do you reach those people? Okay. A good crisis plan must be communicated to the crisis managers, the crisis team before the crisis. Again, when I started in crisis communication, it used to be a big 3-ring binder. It looked very nice, nice cover. It's in an office somewhere. No one pays attention to that anymore. We are all in the electronic age, so things are very different. So it has to be portable. That means if the crisis happened in Kerala and let's say you're in New Delhi and your other members of your team are in Kolkata, you should be able to immediately connect electronically, and then people know exactly what to do. Your team knows exactly what to do. That's why today a good crisis plan is portable and it's available in all formats: electronic, handheld devices, virtual, in a dark site available only to members of your team, of course. And you have to have a team, an internal crisis team, regardless of the culture. And depending on the organization, a team that consists of, depending on the organization, definitely IT should always be a member of that crisis team. Depending on the organization, your safety team, and of course, your communication team. Again, depends on the organization, depends on the size of the organization and the resources of the organization. A good crisis plan is one in which you identify a single spokesperson, but also have substitute spokespeople. Preferably, if it's one that you're going to go into, again, back to the example that I used earlier, someone who understands the terrain, who understands certain nuances. Certainly the person might be working for a company or an organization, but understands the culture of that place and uses the appropriate language that not only the media can get, but also the folks in that area can get. So during crisis, what happens? The number one priority when a crisis occurs is to terminate and contain very quickly. Again, back to my example of the flooding in Kerala. We want to get control over the situation, get people out as quickly as possible, because human life is much more important than anything else. Now, keep in mind, pre-crisis, people have been notified, here are the things that need to be done, and so on and so forth. And then the crisis occurs, terminate or contain as quickly as possible. And this is why you work in teams. You're gathering as much information as possible. Keep in mind the elements of crisis. Things are fluid, things are dynamic, and the information that is gotten right away may not be the information that would emerge maybe a few hours later, but gather as much information as possible. And then, if possible, set up a physical emergency operations center. It may be possible, it may not be possible, and definitely a virtual emergency operations center whereby you're communicating via your phones. But a physical emergency operations center is necessary away from the center of the crisis. Then that way you have a place to gather. You have a place where you can give a conference to the media, talk to the media, and where people can very quickly reach you. Again, depending on the nature of the crisis and what is available. But that is information, that is a plan that should be done before the crisis. Also during the crisis, now keep in mind, because you have a team, you are gathering information and using that information to provide to your audience. Again, back to the example in Kerala, right? You're getting information out to the people using folks within the community or using your team to basically get information out to people, whichever means, through the channels that the people are already used to, not new channels, not new channels. You use the channels that they're already used to, so they would know how and where to evacuate to. You want to be able to communicate early to restore credibility, provide information, accurate information. If there's a mistake made on the information, correct it. Communicate with the direct affected audiences so they would know what to do. Using respected messengers within that community. This is something that is very important. Use people within that community that the community knows and respects. People who they would listen to. You use them. Again, you don't develop a relationship with them during the crisis. You already have a relationship with them before the crisis. Again, this is part of working with the community. They don't have to work in your company or work in your government, but they're people with whom you have developed a relationship. Because for the community in times of crisis, communication is important. They need to know, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we get there? I can't say enough about communication. In some cultures, the concern for people is often accompanied by some tangibles. Yes, show concern for the audiences. Then what next? What next? Is there a place for them to go to? Even a temporary to go to. Other things to consider that really speaks to culture. In a very religious country like India, are there temples for people who are displaced? Are there temples for them to go to? Is it the same temples that they're used to? But are provisions made for that where they would gather for, their very important religious rites? So yes, empathize with them, but also to ensure that there's some minimum tangibles provided. Obviously, one cannot make all the changes that would allow them to live their normal life in a crisis situation, but are there some efforts made to ensure that there are some tangibles, a shelter, some food, and then that very important part of their lives, their religious rites, are those done? So they're going to want to know this. So we've gotten ourselves away from danger, then what? That is something that is not necessarily the same everywhere, but again, you have to look at your culture. What holds true? And those are the things that people will remember. So communicate, let people know these are the things that you are doing, or you will do, or you have done. That gives them some level, some peace of mind, particularly in a crisis, because the level of anxiety is very, very high. And you want to be able to not eliminate it, but bring down the level of anxiety. Also during crisis, important to consider our reality today, the impact of social media on cross-cultural crisis communication. Perfect example, COVID, right? This pandemic. There are all kinds of stories in different cultures, in different countries, even within this country where we live now. Conspiracy theories about COVID, conspiracy theories about the vaccine and the origin of certain vaccine and the content of certain vaccine and the effect of certain vaccines and all kinds of things. You got to consider that. You've got to consider the impact of culture on the perception of things like that. In the example of COVID, that some people didn't even believe it was a thing in some cultures. And now we're dealing with the issues of the COVID vaccine. One must understand that and not simply brush them off and not simply laugh at those people and not simply criticize them, but to get to the bottom of it, to say, if this is what they believe, how can we still use the culture, their understanding of the culture, to provide the accurate information on, such as the things like the COVID vaccine, to encourage them that if they have access to it, to take it. So, but one must consider the cultural impact, the cultural issues related to this, and not brush it off. People get very offended, and rightly so, when their cultural beliefs are dismissed because it is not modern or it is not Western. That's very offensive. So as communicators, we've got to understand that. Understand the local etiquette in a crisis situation, understand the local etiquette in the country or in the region in which we're operating, understand the system, basically understand the culture and how things function there, and not be dismissive of it. Instead, to ask, how can we walk within that? How can we walk with that belief system to still get our message across? And I share with you some examples on this PowerPoint on culture and how culture can and does affect crisis response. I think these are really very good examples of what not to do and what to do. So I'm not going to get into them, but I'll make this available to anyone who is interested. So what do we do post-crisis? How do we act post-crisis? When a crisis is over, absolutely essential to declare it over and communicate the same thing to stakeholders, to your public, using the same media, using the same language, using the same forum, using the same messengers that you used before. Communicate corrective steps that you've taken. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for instance, there is a brush fire and within a particular community, and you were able to get people to evacuate. And then your team comes in, let's say the government, for instance, or some company, and you were able to bring it under control. Now, people have been evacuated from that community, so they were not there. All the information that they're getting through the media. But the fire's been brought under control, hopefully with minimal damage. Of course, people are concerned about their property. They want to know, how do we get back? It is important then, as a crisis team, to be able to communicate to them the steps you've taken, the corrective steps, and whether it is safe for them to come back to their homes. Okay, well, you've got to communicate that to them. All right. I don't know what happened to my PowerPoint. It simply disappeared. Okay, well, in any case, my PowerPoint has disappeared and I don't have an idea what's going on. But in any case, since I know what I'm going to be talking about, I'll just continue talking about it. So you communicate to them when that the crisis has been, that the crisis is over, so that it will be safe for them to come back. The most important thing that I want to make sure that I drive home to everyone is the role of culture at the center of everything that you do. Because it's very easy for people who are not from non-Western cultures particularly to go to non-Western cultures and communities and say, well, this is the way things have been done, and this is the way to get the results that we're looking for. Therefore, this is what you should do. Far from it. We must respect the cultures of the communities in which we work with. We have to make an effort to understand those cultures, make an effort to understand the cultures and work within the culture, because there are so many lessons that we can learn. There are many lessons that we can learn from finding ways to integrate the knowledge we have with the knowledge, the local knowledge and the culture of that particular culture that we are dealing with. So to wrap up my presentation part of this is this. I've talked to you about 3 phases of crisis communication. What does one do before a crisis occurs? What does one do during crisis? And what does one do after crisis? And what is the role of culture? What is the role of culture at all 3 stages? And why is culture important? Why is culture important in crisis communication? If nothing else, the current COVID pandemic, this global pandemic, has reminded us or is teaching us the important role of culture in risk and crisis communication. It's teaching us how globally connected we are. It's teaching us how transboundary crisis is, that crisis is no longer limited to a particular geographic area, or that crisis may start in a particular geographic area, but it spreads across the world. And therefore, our response to crisis must consider the cultural aspects of risk and crisis communication. And that also means something else, that as a crisis communicator, in developing a crisis plan for our different audiences, depending on the type of audience, we must center issues of culture. We must center the culture of that particular audience. We must make it a part and parcel of our risk and crisis communication plan. Again, if nothing else, COVID has reminded us of the importance of culture in risk and crisis communication. And I would like to end here because it's about almost 1 hour, and I would like the rest of the time to be used for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Madam, for a very wonderful brainstorming session you had. Now I would like to invite Professor B.C. Das for go for a quick comment, please.
Okay, who are we waiting for? I see questions in the chat box. Okay, so I'll just wait for you to let me know what to do. Okay.
Yes, madam, please go through the chat box and give
Answer
the
some of the
answers.
questions.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
perfect. Okay, so one of the questions is, how do you differentiate between the crisis of communication and crisis in communication during the unprecedented times of the pandemic? That is really an excellent question. you know, the saying that common sense is not that common holds absolutely true. Okay. One of the assumptions that one would make is that people would communicate, particularly people in authority would communicate clearly, easily to audiences, especially at this time, on what to do. And I should share with you that some colleagues of mine and I were finishing up a research paper on directives, communication via press releases from the offices of governors of 5 states. And in looking at those press releases, we can see where there is a little bit of a problem with communication. Some are very clear, direct. Some are not exactly so. Now, that is coming from those particular offices. And then, of course, there is communication coming from experts in the media. Then there is communication coming from non-experts who would like to claim some expertise in some area. So there is an abundance of communication, and that is confusing. In fact, in our research, we concluded that there is a need for some master narrative, a master narrative whereby there is this core message coming in the case of COVID, coming from the appropriate health, from the appropriate quarters, the health experts, which would basically not only counter all of those minor narratives going around that is very confusing to people, the crisis in communication, okay, but that would make it clear that this is the core message. But it becomes even more confusing for a lot of people because political ideologies seep into some of the communication. And that's why I don't blame people. I don't blame some people who are simply confused. They're simply confused, like, where do we go or what do we believe? But I always believe, and I agree with my colleagues in the study that we're doing, that there should be a master narrative, and that master narrative should be re-emphasized. It should be reiterated at all times, reiterated. Okay, all right. So here's another question. Do you think that the indigenous knowledge that the tribes / Adivasis community possess, like the practice of ethnic medicines and indigenous food, which protected them from the unprecedented times of pandemic, need to be communicated to the world for the larger interest? Absolutely, absolutely. I think the mistake comes from when we assume that just the Western approach is the answer to everything. Not so. There's a reason why those people have been using those herbal medicines, by the way, which people quote unquote discover and turn into pills. They've been using those and have been surviving on them for a long, long time. And if you look at our diets today, we're all going back to nature. We're all going back to natural foods. We're all going back to that. We're all moving away from processed foods to natural foods. Why is that so? Because there is now a clear understanding that there is merit in eating organic as opposed to processed food. So there is knowledge that we could tap into, and I'm a great believer in that, not just on a personal level, but studies have shown, again, tap into indigenous knowledge and use what you can, again, work with them to use what we can get from them to create something that is not only workable for them, but also workable for others. And I know that India is a leading country in these kinds of things. So absolutely, I absolutely believe that. Okay. Okay, another question. What would be crisis for tribal people who do not have any idea about crisis? How would they deal with it? Well, they may not use the term crisis the way we use the term crisis, but a crisis is a crisis nonetheless. Does it disrupt their way of life at a particular time? Does it make it impossible for them to do certain things? Basically, is it disruptive? Is it dangerous? It is a crisis. Now, they may have different ways of dealing with it, excuse me. They may have different ways of dealing with it. So let's take a look at the ways they deal with it. Is it something that's workable for them? Is it something that is workable for them at a time like this? Again, we have to, first of all, look at what they have. Now, if you think of, with COVID, for instance, you know, one of the things that we're told to do, social distancing, which makes sense, use masks, which makes sense, and subsequently, when the vaccines were available, get vaccinated. But think about it. In a society where some people have to work every day, there's subsistence, they have to go to work every day, okay? And have to work, they have to interact with people. So they don't have the luxury of social distancing, okay? And they lived in packed quarters because they can't afford to live in houses with a lot of space. It's just what it is. One has to look at what would work for them, what is workable for them when they don't have the privileges that you have. You know, I can work from home, you have internet access. They don't have that. In fact, they may not even have the privacy of being in a room by themselves. They have to share with other people. What are some of the things that are workable for them in that context, as opposed to social distancing? Again, it depends on the culture. You have to look at the culture. So I am not here to prescribe at all. I can't, and I shouldn't. But you look at the culture, what is workable? How can we use what's already available and make it work for them? And that's what we're going to do in that circumstance. In terms of prescribing, I can't do that. I have no right, no authority to do that. But look at what exists. How do we maximize what exists? And that they would also accept, and it is workable for them. Okay, let me look at another question. How can we expect free and fair flow of communication in a post-truth social order when media houses become the mouthpiece of government in democracies and its propaganda machinery, even in times of pandemic, that masks the actual suffering and problems of different marginalized sections of our society? True, true, and true, unfortunately. And it's not just in your part of the world, in other parts of the world. And it is not surprising at all. There was a study that came out, I believe it was in 2020, on people's perception of the media. It is a challenge. It is a problem, even in this country. Not that the media are mouthpieces of the government, but that they're considered mouthpieces of some political parties. You know, same thing, okay? It is a challenge. As a college professor, in working with students, And one of the things that I'm teaching global communication, one of the courses that I'm teaching this semester. And I show them different examples, you know, from, by the way, also from your country, from different parts of the world. And we analyze media sources. And I ask them the same questions, you know, where do you go to get information, and why do you go there, and why do you believe the information that you get from there? And we conclude that, frankly, the more information you get, the better. So as not to rely on information from a particular source. And I practice that myself. You know, I read a lot. I get news. I don't watch that much television, but I get news from a variety of sources, you know, and I'm not going to mention names, but some global news organizations, because I want to generally see, how is this one story reported? You could see from a mile away the slant of some publications. So we have to continuously educate ourselves to be media savvy, but not everybody has the luxury that we have, that we could do that. It is a challenge. It is a challenge indeed. But again, when some of these are quite obvious, that's why, fortunately, people are no longer relying on just one source of information. There are news organizations that, for whatever reason or the other, are not able to publish hard copies, but they're online. Again, sometimes we learn things about our country from outside news sources. So yeah, it is a challenge. So there isn't some answer, some clear-cut answer. It is a challenge. And I say, keep looking for information. Seek, the more you seek, the better. The more you seek, the better. Yeah. And that's why some might claim that citizen journalism is important. But then again, there's also the issue of bias there, because people can simply go online. I can set up a website and publish whatever it is I want to publish there, and it may be accurate, it may not be accurate. It's not the kind of answer you want. And I have seen some of those, but then again, look for information from more than one source. All right. Let me look at a few other questions here. Okay. Okay, said you talk about mass crisis communication in intercultural contexts. What modern frameworks of general cultural analytics or culture-based communication? Let me focus on the second, culture-based communication. And I'm not trying to plug my book, which is Crisis Communication from Non-Western Cultures. I believe very strongly, and research has shown that there's a highly respected colleague of mine who happens to be from India, Mohan Dutta, who is at Massey University in New Zealand, whose work I respect greatly. He does a lot of work on culture and health and has published a lot, highly respected all over the world. And Mohan is also a good friend of mine. And the thing about culture-based communication, I think is very important. I think it's being recognized now in the West that one cannot go to non-Western countries with the one size fit all, because one size does not fit all. Even starting from this country in the USA, as an example, we have people of different cultural backgrounds living here. Let me use an example, give you an example. There is the Hispanic Latino community, okay? One looking in from the outside would assume, well, if I'm a marketer, I'm advertising, I want to reach this audience, I can simply get my material in English and translate it into Spanish and push it out to this audience. You do that, you may not reach your audience. Why? Because you make the assumption that After all, this is a culture-based communication, and I just translate to Spanish and send it out. That wouldn't do, because even within the Latino community, I live in Texas. In Texas, you have a lot more Mexican Americans. In Florida, you have more Cuban Americans, and then some from Venezuela and places like Colombia and places like that. In New York, you have more Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. In California, people from El Salvador, Nicaragua, Washington, D.C. area, and so on and so forth. So there are those nuances, even within that culture-based communication. There are those nuances that as a marketer, as a crisis communicator, advertiser, you must recognize and not make the assumption that, oh, they're all Latinos, and I'm just going to push out this information, translate into Spanish, and get it out to them, and it would work. It doesn't work that way. One must recognize, just like your great country of India, one country, different languages, different nuances, that anyone marketing has also got to understand those things and target their communication, target their crisis communication to those particular audiences. So the example in the US with the Latino community really helps me to highlight the importance of the real culture-based communication. Simply translating to a different language is not it. That's not enough. Got to understand the nuances, those things that don't always come up to the surface. You think of the definition of culture, it's like an iceberg. What you see at the top is just what you see at the top. A lot of it is underneath, which you have to study, to understand. And once you get it, those nuances that are not at the top of the iceberg, those nuances make a difference. Okay. Oh, okay. Someone else knows daughter. That's fantastic. All right. Okay, so I've been told here that all the questions may not be accommodated because of time. So how
Thank
we
you.
do time?
Thank you
Yes.
so much, madam. If your time permits, I would like to ask one small question to you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, madam, for a wonderful deliberation and all the answers you have given. I would like to know from you, from Gramsci to Habermas, via Mohan and Amiso, right? From C square plus C square. One is said culture and crisis and communication, and then this content or community, which is based on particular in terms of 21st century globe. The electoral democracy should be now become the electoral autocracy. What do you feel the power hegemonic approach in terms of political crisis of communication? Do you believe in 21st century globe, we had a second choice through cross-cultural communication, or we have to be sensitize our own self from culture to communication?
Could you repeat the last part again? Do we have to?
Yeah, a political crisis from culture to communication, or communication to culture?
Political crisis, culture to communication, communication to culture. Well, I would say culture first, okay?
Great.
Once we understand culture first, and we wade into politics, understanding culture first makes a huge difference in how we approach political issues. Okay, I hope I'm answering your question. Understanding the culture makes it a huge difference before wading into politics. We can't wade into politics and then learn about the culture later on. So we've got to understand the culture before we wade into politics. Here is an example which I hope really speaks to this. if I am coming to India for the first time, okay, and I've been invited to India, to be there physically, I've got to learn certain things about Indian culture. So when I get there, I would behave in a proper and respected manner towards my Indian hosts. Okay, that is understanding and respecting the Indian culture before I go there and before I interact. So understand the culture before the politics, because if you understand the culture, and even if you make a mistake with the politics, you are more likely to be forgiven than wading into politics first and then thinking about culture as an afterthought.
Fantastic, madam. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I would like, if anybody would like to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. I am on LinkedIn, which will be a great, just Google Dr. Amiso George on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with any of you on LinkedIn. And I really appreciate and really honored to have been asked to speak to your audience wherever they are.
Definitely, madam. And before I would go to the end of the session, I would also like to invite in physical mode to India. Anywhere in India and any institution, you have to go there and speak a little bit, interact with our students. It's a proud privilege and honor itself, madam. Thank you so much for connecting all the way from Texas, USA. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Neena Das to go for a formal vote of thanks. Thank you so much, madam.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Dear Excellencies and distinguished guests, particularly our esteemed Chief Speaker, Ma'am Joyce, ma'am. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Dr. Neena Das from Gangadhar University, Assistant Professor, Odisha. I am very privileged to propose a vote of thanks to today's Chief Speaker. Ma'am, we are really very fortunate to have you here on behalf of Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha. I'd like to express my deep sense of gratitude. Ma'am, thank you so much. Deep sense of gratitude to you, madam. You have shared with us your valuable experiences, and you have worked so much in this field. We are really very blessed. You have also highlighted what is crisis, that it is an opportunity for growth and change, and communication is the key, and communicate whatever we have done, communicate findings of a risk assessment to management, to community leaders, to communicate to all the stakeholders before, during, and after the crisis. That is very important to minimize this reputational damage. Communicate to help minimize stress and confusion during crisis, and to help in faster recovery. A crisis plan, if documented, it would go a long way. That is very important. And at the time of crisis, ma'am, you have highlighted that we must target message to specific stakeholders using appropriate communication channels. People need accurate information. That is really very important for everybody at local, at national, and international level. As people need accurate information, people will make decision based on that information only. And a good crisis plan is always crucial. Acknowledging the pain is very important. I would like to, ma'am, highlight here that the Odisha state in India, it is the first state in crisis management, and it is first in all over India for crisis management. And this is because as you have said, that people like to feel valued, and a good crisis plan has clearly defined objectives. A good crisis plan identifies a single spokesperson. The world is more interconnected than ever. That is why we have with us you today. Really, it is more interconnected, and crisis transform extraordinary than ever. And I would like to end my vote of thanks with a quote from Peter Marshall, that small deeds done are better than great deeds planned. And at the end, not at the end, but I would like to also propose vote of thanks to our esteemed director, sir, director of CARD, who is present here, who has coordinated all this global conference. This is a very difficult task to coordinate this global conference. Thank you, Vikram sir. And I also like to thanks all the coordinating team, Dr. V.C. Das, Rudra sir, and everybody, Loknath sir, everybody, all the professors who have coordinated. I would also like to thank all the participants, particularly here today, Badim, Michael Vesky sir, and then Dipanjali Sahu, Subham Das, whoever has interacted today. I would like to give vote of thanks to all the research scholars and professors present here. I'd also like to give thanks to our patrons of the university, Vice Chancellor, Revensa University, Director, IIM Sambalpur, Vice Chancellor, Central University of Koraput, Chandi Prasad, Dr. Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda sir, and everybody who is with CARD. So thank you, ma'am, for sharing your valuable experiences and sharing your valuable time with us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Namaste, madam. Namaste and bye bye. Thank you so much.
Namaste. Namaste, everyone.